and welcome to our discussion on vampirism in Gothic literature. Vampires are said to be reanimated human beings of the dead who feed on the blood of the living. These vampires would feed at night, and depending on what a person may be reading or watching, the vampire's prey may be sleeping or awake. Some vampires do not feed on blood, but would still drain the life of their prey. This is what we call a metaphoric vampire. Vampires can be seen in TV shows such as Vampire Diaries and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. They're also in movies such as Vampire in Brooklyn and the Twilight Saga, and in Gothic literature such as Bram Stoker's Dracula. Where does this idea of vampires come from? It actually comes from Slavic folklore. Similar to other folklore, the idea of vampires was to explain the strange and unusual. In this case, it was to explain the decomposition of human corpses. During this time, people were finding that their dead were not decomposing in a way that was normal. They didn't realize that certain factors, such as weather conditions and the way people were buried, played a role in the speed of decomposition. What people were finding was that these corpses were pretty much still intact, but they had blood around their mouths and noses, giving rise to the idea that the dead were feeding on the living. These vampire stories eventually influenced Gothic literature. Let's look at some of the literary beginnings of metaphoric vampires. Again, the first true vampire was Count Dracula, who first appeared almost 80 years after the publication of Northanger Abbey. The Castle of Otranto, however, is where we will begin our discussion. The Castle of Otranto is considered the start of the new literary genre, the Gothic. Its protagonist, Manfred, is not a hero. Rather, he's a villain. He is a metaphoric vampire. I encourage you to pause the video to see sections from the beginning and the end of the story that encompass Manfred's vampiric qualities. The death of his son gives Manfred a chance at marrying Isabella and prolonging his bloodline with a stronger, healthier heir. He also attempts to assault Isabella, giving readers an idea that these vampiric characters care for nothing except for survival and their own sadistic glee. Finally, the last section details how Manfred utilizes a dagger, which is a short, sharp weapon used to draw blood. In many ways, a dagger is like the sharp fangs that traditional vampires are associated with. In the Mysteries of Udolpho, society is something of a moral vampire that can convert the hearts of many and make them into Gothic, life-sucking vampires. Before Saint Aubert dies, we watch his health ebb and flow. When his illness is at its worst, it's because he's had some contact with the upper-crust society that he often admonishes for his daughter's benefit. It's the mention of a marquis and a marchioness, two very wealthy figures from his past, and the subsequent grief that send him into the final fatal spike of his illness. We're told that Montoni has a great passion for gambling. His expensive vice seems to have taken from him his morals and turned him into a tyrant. He, more so than his wife, bleeds Emily of hope and joy. Because of his constant ambition, he's willing to rip from Emily her autonomy and force her to marry Count Morano. And it's not only Emily who is affected by him. There's a notable change in Madame Chiron's general countenance after their union. She's often upset because of his emotional and physical distance from her. Count Morano, too, is a vampire. His repeated and increasingly obvious attempts to woo Emily have forced her to shrink from his assiduities and to a timid reserve. When that doesn't work, she tries outright denial. Eventually, though, his persistence forces her to abandon her pride and all but beg him to free her from his pursuit. He seems to feed off of her resistance and ignores all of her denials. Tilney is the vampire in Austen's Northanger Abbey. It becomes very clear very quickly that his presence has a negative effect on his children's mood. In chapter 16, Catherine is to dine with the family for the first time, and despite all of her excitement surrounding the event, it falls flat. Being good-natured, she refuses to blame it on the general, as you can see here. Yet it's undeniable that when she runs into Henry and Eleanor that very night at the pump house, she finds them as agreeable and attentive as ever. When the general must go to London for some time, she notes a drastic change in both her mood and that of her friends. Both Henry and Eleanor are temporarily prevented from true happiness by their father's hunger for more power and money, each forbidden to marry the person of their choosing. In doing so, he sapped much of the joys out of those intervening months, or perhaps years for Eleanor, and it's only the promise of monetary gain that encourages him to offer his consent to the marriages. We hope you have enjoyed this discussion on vampirism in Gothic literature.